Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on just transitions. It's great to have you with us today. My name is Ben Cahill. I'm a senior fellow with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And we're really pleased to welcome you to this discussion on just transitions. We have a great lineup of speakers and really looking forward to the discussion today. I wanted to briefly go through some housekeeping and rules of the game today, and then just kind of outline what's on the agenda. So in terms of the workshop guidance, this is webinar format. We definitely welcome questions from the audience. We encourage all of you to send questions into our panelists. We will be monitoring the Q&A and encourage you to send those through, and we'll try to work in as many questions as we can into the discussion. In order to do that, the way to send questions is to use the Q&A button. It should be right at the bottom of your screen in the middle. Go ahead and click that and send in your Q&A, and again, we'll monitor them throughout. There is a chat function available as well, but the way to send your questions through to the speakers and the moderator is to use the Q&A function. You're welcome to use the chat function. We're very happy to have an array of people dialing in today from lots of different locations, lots of organizations, so the chat is a great way to share resources and information, send links, start a dialogue. So please go ahead and do that. But if you do want to send in questions, use that Q&A button. Another thing to note here, in Zoom there is a raise hand feature, but we will not see you raising your hand. So if you do want to ask a question, again, Q&A is the way to do it. Feel free to use that raise hand function, but probably no one will see it. And the last note here is that this event is going to be recorded and will be available on both the CSIS and Climate Investment Fund's websites. We will share links afterwards to share the resources. So now that that bit of housekeeping is done, let me just briefly run through the plan for this workshop. We have 2 hours today. We're going to start with a welcome and introduction from Mafalda Duarte, who's the head of the Climate Investment Funds. She will then hand it back to me to do a quick overview of some research that we're doing in the Just Transition Initiative between Climate Investment Funds and CSIS. And then we have 2 panels today. The first panel covers gender and informal labor aspects of Just Transitions. We have 2 great speakers from the ILO and from the University of the Netherlands, University of Twente. And then we have a second session on place-based development plans with speakers from the EBRD, the EIB, and the NRDC. So great lineup of speakers. We're really looking forward to both. No break, but we're just going to plow through and have 2 hours of solid discussion. So with that in mind, I think I will stop here and hand it back to Mafalda Duarte to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And again, on our behalf and CSIS, welcome everybody to this really important webinar. In a context of what I believe is a very active week this week, Climate Week, there's quite a number of events happening. I unfortunately haven't been able to attend many, but I believe this is probably one that will attract a lot of interest. Let me just give you a little bit of background on this Just Transition Initiative. It is very clear that, as we go deeper into the climate crisis, that we require fundamental change. Systemic, what we might call systemic change, quite across, many of the sectors of our economies. There will be profound changes needed in terms of behaviors, in terms of how we think about investments, how we think about policies. So we are faced with a very significant challenge. And we are what is required to meet the climate goals is to support such deep changes, systemic changes in a short period of time, which makes it even more challenging. So we need to really make sure that the workers and the communities are safeguarded against the negative impacts, but even more importantly, that they benefit from the opportunities. In fact, this is an opportunity in itself, given that we go through, when we have crisis and when we are asked to go through profound transformations, those are moments where we can actually try to tackle issues that we have known for a while that need to be tackled. In this particular case, social inequalities or social injustices. But in order to achieve that, to achieve, sound climate goals, and address those social injustices and inequalities, we really need to be deliberate. These things are not just going to happen by themselves. So we really need, in thinking about climate action, in thinking about the sort of transformations that will be required, we need to be quite deliberate around what are the expected impacts in which communities, and what is it that we need to put in place and support the countries and the private sector with, so that we end up with social justice outcomes. Because if we don't, what's going to happen in any case is, as we have seen in some countries over the past couple of years, is that the people will not be supportive of the reforms agendas, and will not be supportive of some pretty important measures that align with climate goals. So from an ownership, from a sustainability, from an outcomes point of view, this is actually quite important. And what we have, recognized in our work, we have been working for 12 years now, spearheading climate relevant investments in developing countries through a group of multilateral development banks who are our implementing partners, is that there are a lot of resources out there on a variety of issues, and more resources and information is available. But in this particular area of just transition, the resources are quite limited. We can benefit from work that has been done in the development context and bring it to bear, but the actual resources, tools available that speak to this particular agenda on just transition are quite limited. And this is precisely what decision makers and practitioners need. So with this in mind, we established this initiative with CSIS. This is what we are seeing here in this slide. And really the objective here is to create this public platform of resources and guidance to support just transition work, in countries. We identified, 3 core goals with this initiative. One is basically a primary one was what are the different understandings or gaps in understanding around just transitions, and Ben will outline some of the work we've done here. And we had a first workshop in June around this as well, which is quite interesting. The second big objective is to offer policy recommendations, which will be a little bit more the focus of this session today, based on case study analysis, consultations, various consultations that we are also supporting, and of course, literature review. And third, foster this community of stakeholders for knowledge sharing. There are multiple institutions doing work at the moment in this area. And so bringing them together and trying to bring their work together. And with that, certainly inform the work we do and the work that our implementing partners do. Also inform, the broad range of stakeholders we work with, from governments to private sector, civil society, indigenous peoples and communities. So to inform all of those groups, and try to, exactly as I was saying, foster this community. So these are the 3 key objectives of this initiative. We started off in March this year, and you can see here a little bit of a timeline in this slide. We have a number of blogs and podcasts and events. We have a report that I encourage you to look at, which outlines the origins of this concept and its evolution over time. and also includes a framework that I guess we will be covering today, but if not, you can also see in the documents that are available. The other thing that I have personally found very interesting, and this is an effort that we will continue to undertake, is case studies. We are about to release a case study on South Africa. I encourage you everyone to read as well. I have done it myself and found it extraordinarily informative and interesting. And we intend to do a few more as well, and not just focused on the energy sector, but focused on other sectors as well. A lot of lessons to draw from. I'm not going to expand on the South Africa case study right now. I mean, we actually had a session in July where there was a detailed presentation of that study, but it is a very informative one. So this particular event is now part of this shift to move from research to more specific guidance and tools. Because, you know, our ultimate goal, as I was saying earlier on, is to inform action and inform change. So as Ben has informed all of us earlier on, we will be hearing from a number of speakers that have been doing quite a bit of work in the different areas. And these are very, very critical topics in this broader topic of just transition. So I'm looking forward to hearing from them and for some interesting discussions as well. And I do, again, encourage you to look at the materials available, reach out to us, make suggestions, because we are also very open to suggestions on how we can make this initiative more relevant for action on the ground. So with that, thank you again very much. Ben, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mafalda. Well, I'll keep this brief in the interest of jumping into the panels, but we wanted to briefly introduce some of the research that we've done in more detail. So if you can go to the next slide, what we would like to start with is just some of the initial work that we did on trying to define what just transitions really means. We found that there's been just an explosion of research and interest in this topic in the last couple of years, but the concept of just transitions itself it's a bit difficult to define, and we found that it's a term that really means different things to very different people. It elicits different responses. So initially, when we started the project, we really saw some value in just unpacking what just transitions really means and, you know, the points of reference that people have when coming to the term. So this is a framework for understanding just transitions. And I want to emphasize here that this is not normative. It's not trying to find an ideal definition of just transitions. Really, what we're trying to accurately represent here is, you know, what definition people have in mind when they discuss the term. So we thought it would be useful to break it down across two dimensions. The first is what we call scope, and the second is social inclusion. And I'll show you in a bit more detail here how different actions break out according to these definitions, but it's kind of important to start with first principles. So if we think about the scope of just transitions efforts, you can break it down in two ways. The first is to look at distributional impacts. So who and what is affected by just transitions, by economic transitions generally. Are we talking about small communities, larger communities? Big distributional impacts are more narrowly focused. And then it's important to think about intention too. One thing that we found is that when people think about just transitions, some people have a very narrow definition of what just transitions should try to accomplish. So it's really, for example, about, you know, protecting vulnerable workers in a certain community. Think of coal miners in certain communities in South Africa, for example. Whereas others have a very expansive view of just transitions. Some people think that, you know, we have a system that is ecologically not sustainable. We have political, environmental, social systems that have produced this kind of massive market failure in the form of climate change. And just transitions are really the lever that we should use to correct all those imbalances and reshape all these underlying systems. So some people really see it as, you know, an opportunity to create pretty radical change in the way that we govern our economies and our societies. And it's important to capture that spectrum of definitions. And the other element here is social inclusion. This basically means when you're trying to form policies around just transitions, who gets to decide what happens and who takes part in the process. And these terms will be familiar to those of you who come from the justice school or the justice scholarship aspects of just transitions. The two dimensions that we've listed here are recognition and procedural justice. Recognition basically means who's represented in just transitions processes, who has a voice, who's listened to. And the procedural justice, is that participation meaningful? So do people from the bottom up really have a meaningful way to get involved in what their future should look like? What alternative livelihoods and pathways are available to them? Those are the kind of dimensions that we're trying to capture here. This is all part of a first paper that we published several months ago. It's listed on both our site and the Climate Investment Fund site. We encourage you to check it out. It explains all these concepts in more detail. But again, these are kind of first principles of just transitions. If you go to the next slide, this is just a slightly more detailed way of looking at it. And what we've tried to capture here in the 4 quadrants, 1, 2, 3, and 4, is if you look at these dimensions of scope and social inclusion, this gives you a sense of the different types of just transitions efforts that are being tried around the world and the ways that people think are ideal to try to use just transitions to capture or to try to affect meaningful change. I won't go through them all in detail, but it's really just to underscore that people come at this from very different perspectives, and some people almost want to protect not the status quo, because the status quo is not really sustainable with climate change, but more of a status quo type of approach on the left versus a very expansive, very ambitious approach to just transitions in the top right. So that's a bit of background on just transitions, an initial framework that we've developed to understand the term. And now, as Mafalda mentioned, we're kind of pivoting from more general research to more specific concrete tools and objectives that we want to try to offer so that we can do just transitions well. And this is something that we've developed as part of ongoing research. We're working on our second research paper as part of this initiative. And we really wanted to think about what are the concrete objectives of just transitions efforts and what tools are available to policymakers, governments, civil society organizations, labor groups, and everyone else who cares about outcomes. And the way that we try to break this down is on the left, you can see some things that are sort of enablers for just transitions or cross-cutting principles, like doing good political economy analysis. How do you understand key actors in a certain region or country, what their influence is, their preferences, what they want in terms of just transitions. Other things that we think are essential to doing this well are good stakeholder engagement, helping capacity building for various groups. And then impact analysis. So, I mentioned distributional impacts, thinking about who and what will be affected by just transitions efforts. That is important at the outset to make sure you're designing the right kind of policy interventions, but it's also important for monitoring and evaluation throughout the process to make sure that you're gauging what impact you have and on what groups. So these are kind of first principles of just transitions. And then if we think about objectives and tools, this is where we zoom in and get a little bit more concrete. And the main objectives that we try to capture here are very broad. Things like promoting decent work and labor protections, creating good regional development and place-based investment plans, which is something we're going to talk about in a bit more detail later, encouraging decarbonization, and then mobilizing climate finance. We've had a lot of discussions about how to do that well. So those are kind of broad objectives. And then if you look at the right-hand side, these are specific tools that we can offer to do this well. And what we're trying to do throughout the initiative and our ongoing research is kind of tackle the complexity of doing all these things. If you look at this list of tools at the right, there's a lot of research to be done on what works and what doesn't, and why, and in what context. But these are lots of tools that are available to people. And what we want to do today is talk about 2 of these issues in more detail. Gender dimensions of just transitions and the role of informal labor, and then place-based investment, which is the second category here. So the reason why we wanted to dive into these is try to illustrate some of the complexities of doing just transitions and use these 2 dimensions kind of as a window to having that dialogue. And I think with that in mind, it's probably a good time for me to stop here, and I will hand it over to Sarah Ladislau, who heads up the energy program at CSIS. She's going to be the moderator for our first panel. And Sarah, please take it away. Thank you.
Great, thanks Ben, and thanks for everybody who's tuning in today. Like Ben and Mafalda said, this is a really important pivot moment for us in this project where we're really turning from what we conceive to be as sort of the conceptual elements of understanding where different policymakers and communities are coming at this issue of just transitions, and taking a look, a more concrete look at how people around the world in different areas are trying to use sort of different tools and strategies for dealing with just transitions. I think the good news for all of us working in this space is that more and more people are talking about the need for just transitions and what that means for them. And we really see it as one of our core jobs to try and be as helpful as we can to policymakers and communities to talk with them about how tools and strategies can be used to actually implement some of these objectives, and to learn from other people and communities that have tried to do this as well. So I actually feel like I have a great job today. We have an abundance of riches of people who have thought really deeply and have a very good experience on working on some of these issues. As Ben said, we've taken two of them, two particular ones that we think are critically important to focus on, but also quite difficult actually. They're not super easy for policymakers to get their arms around, because they're a little bit different, particularly for local policymakers, to think about how they do some of the things that we're going to talk about today. The only challenge in my job is that we have so many good speakers in a very short period of time. So we thank everybody for their Zoom patience to be able to stare at the screen for this period of time, and for all of our speakers to be able to get through work that deserves full webinars of their own in a short period of time. So for this first panel, we're going to talk about the gender and informal labor component pieces of a just transition. We really want to, as I said, focus on the tools and the practical strategies that go along with trying to make sure that gender dimensions and informal labor are considered as we're thinking about just transitions in the context of climate change. So I am very delighted to have two excellent speakers to get us kicked off in those topics. Ana Sanchez, who is the Regional Green Jobs Specialist for Latin America at the International Labor Organization. I know we've benefited a lot from the ILO's work on a range of different dimensions, and so very pleased to have Ana with us today. And then Joy Clancy, who is from the Department of Governance and Technology at the University of Twente and the founding member of the International Network on Gender and Sustainable Energy. I'm not going to say much more because I think we should get into their presentations. Each is going to present. I may ask a couple questions if we have time, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So please do ask questions via the procedures that Ben mentioned earlier. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ana. Ana, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be part of this very important panel, and of course, to discuss about this issue of just transition, informal economy, and the gender dimension. So yeah, I will go directly to present, well, to start with my presentation. So next slide, please. That's where I'm gonna talk a little bit. What's the work that we are doing as ILO in Latin America and the Caribbean on just transition and green jobs. Second thing is we will discuss a little bit about informal employment and how this is related to just transition and the specific challenges that we see about that. We'll see a little bit more about the gender issues, and we'll share some ideas on policy guidance and some tools to address this particular link that is related to just transition. So next, please. This is a very important reminder why us as ILO, the International Labour Organization that we normally work on decent work, are working on environmental areas, no, climate change and other areas of work. So here you have a brief explanation about where are the links, where are the environmental challenges, and how those affect the work. And it's important we have this into account. Some examples, so air pollution. The problem that we have with air pollution is that it reduces productivity and working hours, mainly in urban areas, because those urban areas is where we have the most important, the most prevalent problem, and provoke important diseases, chronic respiratory diseases, etc. This has a very close link with some of the workers, some of the sectors that have to work outdoor every day. Next, climate change, thermal stress, which is very important and unfortunately is increasing, causes loss of productivity. It's already reducing the working hours and it's worsening working conditions. We all know about the increase of diseases and it's affecting some sectors more than others, like agriculture, tourism. All these type of sectors are very much affected by them. Something that we need to take into account, like only in Mexico and Central America, there could be almost 4 million climate migrants very soon. And this is a picture from a very recent march that we had in Central America from migrant population. And by 2030, we expect as well loses almost 3 million full-time jobs in the Latin America and the Caribbean region in those sectors that I have mentioned: agriculture, waste, clean energy, and clean energy, no, waste and waste management, and the construction sector. Okay, so loss of biodiversity and damages of ecosystems. We can't forget that an estimated 64 million jobs depend directly of ecosystem services. That means that if the ecosystem does not work well, deforestation and land degradation and some other factors are affecting those ecosystems, we will not be able to have those jobs. And the sectors that are greatly affected, again, agriculture, fishing, tourism, industry that depends on water and biodiversity inputs as well. In a natural disaster is as well affecting a growing number of population, and this is as well affecting workers, and this is increasingly affecting workers. So we need to do something about that. And what's the problem about that is that most of the sectors that I have mentioned, agriculture, tourism, fishing, and others, have very high level of informality. So what that means that all this impact on those workers and on those companies that are acting in this sector that I have mentioned will have very little possibilities to address those impacts. For example, as you know, informal people working on the informal economy, they don't have access to social security systems. They don't have the right to collectively bargaining, so they don't have a voice in the decision making. They have lower incomes. They have more variable and more irregular income. So we see that informality is at the center of all these type of problems, because when that happens in other regions where informality is not that high, workers still have, and companies as well, still have the tools and the opportunities to address them adequately. And that's very important to take into account. So next slide, please. How do we work at the ILO? We have very recently launched this ILO Climate Action for Jobs initiative. We have a website where we include all the information that we want to do and we are already doing. So I invite you to go there and take a look to that. Our main goals are enable climate action with decent work and social justice. So very much are the objectives of the Just Transition initiative that we just heard about. Support countries in the transition that I funded on a broad-based support, something that Mafalda also mentioned. We need to have a broad-based support in order for the transition to be a real possibility, and facilitate and promote an inclusive recovery from COVID-19. At the right-hand side, you have an image of the guidelines of the Just Transition guidelines that the ILO constituents, which is workers, employees, and the governments, agreed a few years ago, 1915, and which for us is the political framework of our work at the ILO. Next, please. Okay, so how is the region, the Latin American, the Caribbean region? Okay, we have done we have launched like a month ago, very recently, a new report, ILO and the Inter-American Development Bank together, where we analyze what might be the impact, the job impact of decarbonization in the region. And this is the result. We can create 15 million new jobs. This is new jobs created by in 10 years time, by 2030. But there will be winners and losers. And here you have in the right-hand side, who are the winners and who are the losers in terms of economic sectors. We have agriculture and plant-based foods that together with renewable energies that will be two of the sectors where most jobs will be created, as well forestry. However, we also have some other jobs where jobs will be lost, fossil fuel electricity, fossil fuel extraction, and probably livestock production, because what we believe is that we need a change in our diets towards a more plant-based diets, and that's why you see this type of numbers. In terms of new creation, you have in the blue graphic at the left-hand side, where are the new jobs that could be created? You have Brazil, Mexico, and some others. So you see that this is positive for employment, this is positive for environment. So we need to take that into account to put in place policies, okay? What's the problem? That informality, it's something important in most of the sectors that I have mentioned. So as I said before, informality is at the center of this idea of just transition. Please, next slide. Why is that? In Latin America, 1 out of every 2 jobs are informal in Latin America and the Caribbean. So if you have a job, you have very many possibilities to be working in the informal economy. And that's a problem, because there are many things that are not possible to do it, as I was mentioned before. For example, if those sectors, they are part of the informal economy, they are not organized, and they can't participate in social dialogue processes. They don't have access to social protection systems. They have very little access to capacity building projects. So this idea of the transition, it will be difficult for them to take part of the process. Okay, well, next slide, please. And then we have a very important focus on gender. We wanted to understand in this report that I mentioned that we did together with the Inter-American Development Bank. We wanted to understand what was the gender implication of that. And we found out something that was very impressive. 80% of the new jobs, of these 15 new jobs that could be created, will go to men, will access for men workers. And only 20% of the new 15 jobs that will be created out of the decarbonization path in the region will be benefiting women. So we see that this idea of a green recovery, a green economy, may have a very important and very significant implication on terms of gender inequality in the future in the region. And why is that? Because most of the jobs that are part of what we call just transition sectors, construction, transport, energy, agriculture, manufacturing, industry, men are the ones that have them. So you have here the numbers, 56 million of those just transition workers are men, in comparison with the 22 million workers that are women. So if we do a business as usual scenario, we understand well why this is, we have this situation of 80% going for men and 20% going for women. And what we need to put in place very, very ambitious women equity, well, gender equality and gender equity policies. Please, next. So how is the region in terms of just transition? There are many countries who have already started to work on that. We have Costa Rica. One of the pillars of the decarbonization plan is based effectively on just transition and the labor transition. In Mexico City, which is the image you have at the right-hand side, they have their own a green jobs program. They started last year and keep working on that in Colombia. Last year as well, the Ministry of Labor signed an agreement with a pact, Green Jobs and Just Transition Pact with the ILO, and we are working together on the implementation of that pact. Argentina, they are discussing about green economy, and right now they are discussing in a tripartite manner how this idea of just transition and green jobs could be part of the COVID recovery path. Guyana as well, which is Guyana is a very special country because of the discovery of oil they had a few months ago. And then you also have Chile, for example, where they have already launched the just transition strategy, which is very linked to the coal phase out of the electricity mix. So there are some of the things that I have not mentioned, and that are already going on. So it's important to understand that just transition is there, it's at the policy level, etc. Very little, however, on informality, and very little on gender equity. So there are areas of work which is very important because we need them, but very little on the areas that I mentioned before. Next slide, please. Okay, how to address that? I was already talking about that. Farming, those are only 3 examples from farming, transport and energy, and sustainable tourism. We need to have very ambitious objectives to stop deforestation, to promote integration of small and big producers, changing diets, etc. But we have to pay attention to the type of work that this sector create: low salaries, lack of social protection, very long working hours, and the need to improve occupational safety and health measures, because right now in these sectors are very low. Transport and energy, we need, of course, to work on this decarbonization of the electricity generation, but especially in the transport sector, we have to pay attention to this idea of employment formalization, because 50% of the employment in the transport sector is informal right now in the region. So we need, of course, social dialogue, but how we need to make sure that this part of the informal sector is part of the dialogue. If you talk about sustainable tourism, I have here the numbers. 55% of all workers active in these sectors are working in the informal economy. More than half of workers work in the informal economy. So what means for them? We have a climate shock, we have something related to a hurricane or floods, something like that, and simply this type of workers don't have any access to anything. They don't go to work next day, and that's it. They don't have access to social protection, to pensions, to any other thing. And there is a very interesting area of work where we can work together on make this sector more more environmentally sustainable, reducing waste, use clean energy, producing eco and local food, and that will create, of course, local jobs, which are very much needed right now after COVID. Next slide, and I think this is the last one. Those are the ideas that we believe could be, make sense in order to have this green and fair recovery, particularly after COVID-19. First of all, of course, supporting formalization of business and workers, facilitating the access of workers to social protection, in particular in the sectors that are very relevant to just transition, agro-construction, waste and energy. Green jobs creation programs, for example, in the form of public employment programs to protect or restore environment, reforestation programs, maritime ecosystem programs. Why those are interesting? Not only because we create temporary jobs, but also because we provide the skills and incomes. And we can include vulnerable sectors like migrant communities. The third element is improve health and safety and health at work, and accompany formalization programs, again in those sectors that are important because of their environmental content. Next, social dialogue for workers and communities, but we need to take into account that social dialogue is not possible if there is not an formalization of the sector, because they need to get formalized in one way or the other, cooperative or some other ways, in order to get a voice, okay? And the last one is for Latin America. This is very important because there has been very little attention paid to that. Industrial development linked to clean sectors, renewable energies, clean vehicles, industrial sectors related to circular economy, industrial eco-park, waste, energy, water efficiency, and everything related to sustainable mobility. So if we put in place all these type of approaches, policy approaches, and this type of concept, it will be, I mean, that will enable a just transition to happen in the region. And yeah, thanks. This is my last slide and my message to the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was such important perspectives, and I think we've gone a little bit long. So what I'm going to do is I'd like to turn to Professor Clancy to talk about some of the gender dimensions in her work. What I will come back to you on, though, Anna, is you mentioned a number of times formalization of the sectors, and I think for many of us, you know, how you actually go about doing that. What are the strategies for doing that? How successful have we been in other places? So when we come back to the question and answer session, I'd love to start with you on that question. But let's turn over to Joy to get us started on women in the just energy transition.
Thank you, Sarah, and also thank you, Anna. I enjoyed what you had to say very much, and I think a lot of what you said actually resonates with the findings that in the Energia Gender and Energy Research Programme we focused on the informal street food sector, and I recognise a lot of what you were saying in our work, and I would also, you know, emphasise that the informal sector exists. It's a global issue. It's not just an issue that's related to developing countries. So and so a lot of what I'm going to say is also comes from that learning that we found in that particular research program. It may sort of be stating the obvious that energy transforms women's and men's lives, but it doesn't always behave in the way that we expect. What we find is that technology makes our lives easier, but it doesn't always do other things that we would like. It's for example, it doesn't necessarily save time, and that's something that we find from actually work in research in the US, which shows that women spend more time doing domestic chores because they do them more often. Our standards also change, so we have to be a bit careful about what assumptions we make and check that our findings actually do occur. Women and men have different energy needs, and that depends on the roles that they have both inside and outside the home. And so that means that things are going to vary with communities and in context. And I had Ben mention about context, and I think that's one of the things in our research program we found, where we had at least 12 countries, and how even say within the informal street food sector in sub-Saharan Africa in 3 countries, how the situation was very different. And that's often, or is in part, is linked to the context, the institutional context in which you are working. For example, in Rwanda, the informal sector does not exist. The government has very strict policies on that. So again, you've got to see the context in which you are working, and even within the same country. Well, I mean, it's in the US context, of course, it's such a huge country, but that's rather stating the obvious that there are very different communities spread throughout the country. But even in a smaller country like the Netherlands, where my university is based, there are these very big differences between the east of the country, the west of the country, the north and the south. So context matters. Now, what we find generally, and I think this is something Anna also touched on, is that women are generally, but not always, and that's something I want to stress as well, is not always are they in a worse social, economic and political positions than men. we use the terms women and men, but they are not two homogeneous categories. They vary across a range of characteristics. And there is a tendency for data to present it as male and female-headed households. And if you look at the data, some of the data the World Bank has collected, that in some countries you'll find that women-headed households have better electricity access than male-headed households. Now, that's not what intuitively we are led to believe. We believe that women are in a worse position than men. So there's a lot more complicated things going on. And so you need to look at those in a much more careful and detailed way. And one of the other things in terms of just transitions, if we're thinking about the green economy and renewable energy is offering up opportunities, one of the other things that you see argued is that women working, it improves their position. Now, position in what sense? Well, certainly economically, it can improve their position, but there is a tendency to think that their lives in general, that they're empowered, immediately comes from having a job. Our evidence shows that doesn't necessarily ring true, that you need more than economic empowerment to have a much greater sense of empowerment for control over your own life. Now, the energy sector, though, does enable women, that opens up new opportunities for women and for men. And Anna gave us some details on that in the context of Latin America. But it also improves the possibility not only to have an energy business, but the way that you use energy within your business. And what our informal food sector work showed, that how having access to electricity opened up the number of products that you could offer, even from the roadside. So there's a lot of opportunity I see here coming. Next slide, please. All right, so what do we think needs to change? Well, lots of things. I mean, Ben's put a limit on the time, but I just want to make a few things that we found. Some of this also comes from the work that my co-author and I, Mariella Veenstra, we've done also some work on what is happening in Europe in terms of energy access and energy poverty. So some of this work also comes from some of the things I'm going to say also comes from that work. I mean, I think, well, it's rather stating the obvious that increasing women's involvement as decision makers in energy policy is something that is needed. You can argue this, as Ben was saying about the just transition, you can argue it from very different perspectives. But one thing I would caution again is about the numbers game. Having 50-50 percentage of women and men on a committee is not necessarily going to bring either a just energy transition or a greater influence of women. It depends on context. And also there is what you tend to find is that if you get a woman on a committee, she's a person put in charge of gender. It becomes women's responsibility. It isn't. It's a joint responsibility. It's something that men as well as women have to be responsible for. And there are many men who are doing that, and that's good to see that you need male champions as well as female champions. You need a strong institutional framework for the gender energy nexus to be a just transition. And here it's not only institutions in the energy sector, but also a much broader set of institutions. Take banks, for example. What we found in our informal sector work is the attitudes of banks to go to lending women's informal sector businesses was very different to male businesses. Women are, you know, it's just pin money. It's money for, you know, small things. It's not so important. They're not seen as key business people by banks. So those are the sorts of attitudes that we need to change. Yes, of course, we need more women in STEM. That's true again from many different perspectives. But what our research, review of the literature found, this is not our particular work, but it's influencing mothers of daughters at a very early age. before you get them into school even, that the mother's attitude to girls doing science is key to getting more girls interested in science. But it's never too late, that you can still influence even as you go higher, you know, go through the age groups. Harvard, for example, has had a very good program on recruiting older girls into coming into science. So it's never too late. It's also about acknowledging that there is a gender gap in energy poverty. Going back to what I was saying about it's not just men and women as two homogeneous groups, what we found certainly in the context of Europe is that the older you are, then the more likely you are to live in energy poverty, and this becomes even more so for women due to things that happen earlier in their life cycle, that they often earn less, so they have lower pensions, and that makes it difficult for them to pay energy bills. So it's about changing your perceptions. I mentioned the one about women's informal sector businesses not being serious businesses. So there's lots of things that need to change. So next slide, please. I think that the energy transition and the gender transition of going towards equality for gender equality there's no question of that. We see three areas in particular where this is opening up opportunities. That in terms of the energy sources, of moving from fossils to renewables, does open up that discussion of decentralization, and decentralization brings you much closer to citizens. And then, as you know, Ben said all there was to say on that issue earlier. Also, policy is now looking much more at demand. Supply, yes, you've got to have an energy supply. If by looking at demand, you get much closer to gender issues of who is responsible for what. And in terms of governance, also going towards facilitation. Again, we had what the CSIS program is doing. I think that there's lots of exciting projects going on around the world on how to engage with citizens, how to engage now, and then citizen is a very generalized term. Citizens are not a homogeneous group. They come in all forms, shapes, sizes, and they need to find how to engage with them. But I see that if the energy transition of doing this also helps gender transition. And now onto my final slide. Oh no, sorry, I've got two more. Well, what can we do? I was asked to give you some tips. Well, I chose three. There are a lot more. There's a lot more out there, and if you go onto the Energia website, then you'll find lots of tools there. But I would say that if you take a gender approach in data collection and analysis, that's going to open up a lot of things for you. Without data, there's no visibility. No visibility, there's no interest. And you get good data by asking the right questions to the right people by the right people. And so you have to, again, understand your community. If it's a community where it's not done for a male interviewer who's not a family member, then you cannot send them to that particular community. But you do see this even in organizations who I think should know better. And it's no good asking. You have to make sure that if you're going to ask questions about cooking, you ask the person in the household who is responsible for that. I would also avoid generic names like communities and citizens, because that hides a lot of the people who you want to get involved. Now, one of the tools that Energia has used is a tool called Gender Audits. Some of you who are aware of gender issues may know about something called gender budgets. Gender budgets is looking at government or in major institutions' finances and how they spend those finances, and are they done in a very gendered way. it requires a really detailed, good understanding of how government's budgets work and formulate. And that it's highly specialized. So this was seen as rather elitist and not very inclusive of enabling a much greater number of people to be involved in policy formulation and implementation. So gender audits is a much more wider way of analysing policy to check on how gender aware it is. So these processes raise awareness, they can help hold policymakers to account, and they can change policy. And you'll find a paper on the Energia website which will give you some more details on this. And another one is organisational assessment. How gender aware and how diverse is your organization? There's plenty of research now to show that diverse organizations in terms of the social characteristics of their employees are much stronger organizations. They perform better, and so I think that this is it's not only it's about your employment policy, but also about the way of doing your business, and I use business in a very generalized way. They're not necessarily in profit making. Okay, some policy recommendations. I've mentioned about collecting sex disaggregated data, which should be presented intersectionally to show variations in communities and identities in terms of ethnicity, in terms of economic status, class, whole ranges, and that begins to show that there are different people who need different support in different types of ways. Having engendered energy poverty indicators, or indicators in general related to energy. Also recognizing that energy is both multidisciplinary and cross-sectoral, that the health sector uses energy a lot. I was talking to a friend who is a microbiologist. He had helped in Sierra Leone set up a laboratory so that they could do monitoring of Ebola. And he said, I got this great laboratory, wasn't any problem to get the money to fund it, no electricity supply to run it. So that there is this cross-sectional need as well. And I would also say that if you're talking to the energy sector, it's better to talk to them about how empowering vulnerable households create potential for upscaling the energy transition. It's better for business. Gender equality will come as a consequence of that. If you talk to them about this is good for gender equality, well, they will go, yes, okay, yeah, fine, don't have a problem with that. But how is that good for my business? Gender equality is also good for business. And that's my last comment. So thank you everybody for listening, and I'm happy to respond to any questions and comments. And thank you to CSIS for asking me to be involved.
No, excellent. Thank you. We're very happy to have you involved. So we have just a few minutes for questions, but I do want to get to a couple. Anna, I do want to ask you that question about, on a very practical level, how do you go about formalizing informal sectors? And is that necessarily the first step to getting social dialogue and the type of things that we need to sort of formalize sectors and then, you know, get them included in these just transitions conversations? And if you can be brief, I'll be able to get in more questions. We've had a number from the audience, so I'll ask you both that.
So yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, formalization is one of the steps that we need to put in place in order to be able to create green jobs and have a just transition. It is an important one because it deals with a very wide range of sectors, of economic sectors that are important for this idea of transforming the economy and making drastic changes and all this that we need towards a more sustainable kind of green economy. But it's not the only one, for sure. We need many other things. We need, for example, training. We have seen that there is a very important training, learning gap in order, I mean, to be able to do things in a correct way, to do buildings that are efficient and use clean energy and recycling the water. We also need new understanding about how we can really use the material that we have in the economy and all this. So informality is one of them, but there are many others. And in relation to social dialogue and how can we work on that, of course, we can find a way of having the voice of the informal economy on the board, but we need to find that way. So how we are going to work with them. And I agree very much with what our last speaker said about trying to avoid names such as community or citizens, because we need to understand who is in front of you in the table where you are negotiating a new plan or a new policy or a new budget or something new. So we need to make sure that we have organized sectors, workers or companies. So we need employers associations, employers organizations, and very strong ones. And for example, they are not strong enough in the green kind of environmental sectors. Same thing with trade unions or employers. We need to be we need them to be stronger in this sector that we have mentioned, like clean energy or construction or waste or recycling or eco-food production and organic agriculture and things like that. So we will find a way of having I was saying that we will find a way of making sure that social dialogue works even if we don't have very strong formalized workers or formalized companies in those sectors that I was mentioning. But we need to find that way, and we need to put in place actions or initiatives to make sure that those workers are well represented and have the opportunity to discuss. We are doing something like that, by the way, in some countries in the region with the new NDCs, so the climate action policies that countries are developing. We are trying to bridge that, to bridge that gap, sorry, and to make sure that those workers are have a seat in the table, in the negotiation table as well. That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna. And good job picking up right where you left off, which is not always easy to do. Joy, if you can hear us and if you're ready, I think, one of the things I wanted to pick up on, and I think we'll make this the last question for this session, and maybe we'll try and get back to some of the ones that we've received from the audience a little bit later, or follow up on them somehow. But you had mentioned sort of the route to empowering vulnerable communities as being a way to sort of more durably engender sort of gender dimensions in a just transition. And I think that that's a really innovative and interesting approach. But could you talk in a greater level of specificity about how you do that, right? So what does that actually look like in practice, and why is that your recommended strategy for thinking about solving some of these gender dimensions? I was going to ask you a data question, but I think that would take up a much longer conversation. So I thought maybe we could start with this. Joy, if you can hear me. Okay, I suspect Joy isn't able to hear right now. So what we'll do is we'll try and come back to Joy towards the end if we've got some time. But I do want to say, thank you to Anna and Joy, and we'll be putting some of the resources that they talked about on the web for you to access, because I think there's a lot more for all of us practitioners in this space to be digging into. So why don't we move to the second panel? And as I said, we'll try to go back and maybe ask some questions if there's time at the end along the lines of what people had posted in the chat for this. So the second dimension here, no less complex than the first, is the issue of place-based investment. And here we wanted to explore place-based investment strategies, regional development strategies, and the role that they're playing for different communities in thinking about moving forward with the just transition, particularly how investors or multilateral development banks are thinking along the lines of place-based investment strategies and regional development and the role that they play in just transitions. And here too, we've got a wonderful group of folks who are involved in this conversation. First, we've got Barbara Rambusek, who is going to be assisted by her colleague, Margarita Calderon. Barbara is the Director of Gender and Economic Inclusion at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Barbara has got a cold, and so we're going to help her power through being able to talk and present, and we know how hard that is to do. So thank you very much for being here. Next, we're going to have Hubert Strauss, who is the lead economist for the European Investment Bank, talk about what EIB is doing. It's been really exciting, quite frankly, to watch EBRD and EIB and Europe as they're sort of pioneering a lot of these techniques and strategies, and we have a lot to learn from them. And then finally, Carolina Herrera who's the manager for Green Finance and Climate Action in the Latin America project for Natural Resources Defense Council. So again, we're short on time, so we'll try and keep these presentations tight so we can get to as many questions as we can, and hopefully we might be able to circle back and hear from Joy as well. So Barbara, why don't you get us started?
Thank you very much, and apologies for my very croaky voice today, but I will try and speak as much as I can. I will be supported by Margarita Calderona, who's in my team and who actually leads a lot of the practical action on the ground in relation to just transition ahead and brings a wealth of knowledge in this context as well. As we have heard already from the two speakers before us, the green transition creates many opportunities, but a lot of challenges. And the big challenge that we all face, I think, if we want to make that green transition sustainable, is that we also bring along with us everybody. We need to make sure that nobody's left behind, that communities, countries, but also individuals, people, different groups of people are not negatively affected, and where potential negative impacts could happen, that those are mitigated and are addressed effectively. At EBRD, we have a mandate to focus on investing primarily in the private sector in order to ensure that our countries of operations become sustainable market economies. What we mean by that is that they fulfill certain criteria, that they become competitive, but also very importantly, two criteria, that they become green economies and also inclusive economies. And it's that nexus between those two strategic priorities that EBRD brings that really lies at the heart of what we do in relation to just transition. We have some experience now on our Just Transition initiative. We have started to do that over the past 2 years. We have a few projects there now, but overall, in relation to particularly the green and the inclusive strategic focus, we bring 3 decades of experience and have large programs that are well established. And bringing those two together now is a very exciting process, and one that we really feel can actually make a difference. If we look at green, we have invested over 33 billion euros already. At the moment, 56% of our investments go into green investments. That will go up to 50% as of next year. So we really have a huge and very ambitious agenda when it comes to green investments. Some flagship programs such as the Green Cities programs, where we work with local authorities, both on investments, but also policy making. But of course, also working very much with the private sector, particularly in hard to abate sectors, to invest in green technologies, and finally supporting SMEs. On the inclusive side, our approach is grounded on the focus on inequality of opportunity. So we look at factors that inhibit equality of opportunity, that lie outside of a person's direct control. So that is gender, that is socioeconomic environment, it is also a place of birth. And all these factors we look at when we actually make our investments, which at the moment have reached about 10.5 billion over the past 5, 6, 7 years. In well over 200 projects. So we focus on women and youth, underdeveloped regions, migrants, and others. We have actually built up a lot of expertise in this context in relation to looking at our clients actually as employers, and creating access to jobs and skills, but also working through intermediaries to enhance access to finance, for example, for young people, for women, but also for less developed regions, and then also in relation to providing access to services from infrastructure to ICT connectivity. So upskilling, reskilling, and related policy initiative, particularly also at the regional level, looking at skills needs, addressing those in an inclusive way, and also supporting SMEs and entrepreneurship is something that really lies at the heart of what we do. In the past few years, and also with the partnership of the Climate Investment Fund, we have expanded what we do in this context, specifically looking at the nexus between gender and green, and scaling up our activities in this context, and very much along the lines of some of the things we've heard earlier in the previous presentations. The next slide will be done by my colleague, Margarita.
Yes, so we have created a series of practically oriented guidelines based on EBRD experience as a transition bank, but also on historical experiences. So the first point is really linked to what Mafalda said at the start, the importance of ownership. And we don't need to delay this process, even though we might not have all the answers right now, because using lead time effectively is really crucial to build consensus around actions and overcome resistance, build capacities, and of course, create local ownership. Also, with place-based strategies, planning should be holistic, should take into account pre-existing inequalities. It should address the multifaceted dimensions of regional development policies. And it should also be integrated within the broader national policies, international policies, or EU policies for certain EU countries. There is a strong need for able institutions and capacity building efforts at the local level to support sustainable and inclusive policy design and investments and the long-term strategies and planning. Of course, there is a clear role for the state on this, but the role of the private sector can also be transformative. And also the important point is, of course, that the decarbonizations must be encouraged across different sectors, as we don't want to use these as a solution for further lock-in, as this would just create new losers. And of course, environmental legacies must be addressed as well. In supporting workers, it is crucial to think about those that both directly and indirectly impacted, as we have seen in the previous presentations, and particularly about disadvantaged groups and such as women, but also young people, older workers. And the support should come in packages with offering new jobs, as well as reskilling and upskilling opportunities, employment services, career counseling, access to financial resources. And this should be well tied to the needs of the local labor markets. And to support this, there should also be economic diversification strategies tailored to the specificities of the affected community, and also considering that in some cases there might be a need for a managed retreat. The next slide, please. And based on these experiences, we defined our 3 priority themes for the just transition, which are around the green economy transition, supporting workers, and the regional economic diversification. On the green economy, we want to work with our clients, both in terms of employers and policymakers, with high carbon, that hold high carbon assets in the transition to a low carbon economy. This might include the reconversion of certain assets, along with remediation, rehabilitation of land, but also supporting the workers that are linked to certain assets. And a series of other green investments that might create access to local employment. In supporting workers, there is a need to promote access and an inclusive access to alternative job opportunities for those whose livelihoods are affected by the transition. And this can be done through tailored reskilling and upskilling programs in the context of addressing the existing inequalities, as I said before. In terms of regional diversification, there is a need to emphasize activities that support competitive small and medium businesses and finance projects, larger projects as well in sustainable infrastructure, where this can be hopefully green and provide also access to jobs. As such, the bank will proactively identify investments and policy activities that can accelerate impact across these three themes. And we also have a series of impact objectives linked and matched to these with relevant indicators and specific benchmarks that reflect the ambition. And these will be monitored throughout the project lifeline.
About 1 minute left.
Okay, thank you very much. If we go quickly to the next slide then, please. So this is just an illustration in terms of the theory of change. So I mentioned those two big strategic areas that we have, our focus on green, our focus on inclusive. As part of how we measure impact and how we design projects, we are developing theories of change for all these themes. This here is an example of the inclusive theme that we are developing. And going forward, what we will do is embed our Just Transition initiative and the activities, the investments and the policy engagement that we do underneath that in that theory of change approach, and to really chart the progress of and the impact that we achieve from the inputs to the outputs and the outcomes, and then the country level impact across those lines. If we go to the next slide. So we very quickly wanted to give you an example of what we actually do in relation to Just Transition in a regional context. I'm focusing on the Western Balkans. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have a wealth of experience yet, but we do have some programs in the Western Balkans where we focus on evidence-based interventions and policy engagement, and that is done through a Just Transition diagnostic. So first we look at a vulnerability screening and a regional assessment to really identify the vulnerable sectors, how they will be affected, who will be affected, the groups, what are the potentials for investments, but also what is the impact on workers and on the regional economic development opportunities. Are there any plans that exist? Who are the governance stakeholders, and what mechanisms may already exist? On that basis, we then develop, together with partners, also a Just Transition action plan that has a clear set of policy and investment activities, but also an action plan to look at who does what, where does the funding come from, where does the interaction come from. On the basis of that, we then design our model. We have a range of different tools that we can mobilize, from investments to technical assistance, policy, dialogue, and of course, targeted concessionality. But the importance is that this is actually embedded and done in cooperation and in alignment with the other stakeholders, the public, the private sector, the local stakeholder, national stakeholder involvements, and then other MDBs and IFIs. We also have strong partnerships with the World Bank, with the EU, with the European Training Foundation, for example, in the Western Balkans, but also the ILO in this context. They all play a very, very important part at a regional level. And the importance is to find the specific contribution that we can make in this context. If we go to the next slide. The COVID crisis has hit us all, and in a way, on top of the challenges that we already faced before the crisis hit, there are now additional challenges because, of course, the pandemic has changed. Inequality challenges has changed the focus on green. And so if we want to actually build back better, we need to understand what these changes mean, what the pandemic has actually done. So we are working very closely to better understand the impact on women, and there is increasingly more evidence that, for example, women hold 39% of global employment, but actually face 54% of job losses as a direct result of the pandemic. So they are much more affected by the pandemic. Young people's education has been interrupted. For aging workers, it's much harder to stay within the workforce or to transit into other sectors. And of course, regions, particularly those that have been looking, for example, as tourism, as one of the areas to diversify into, away from polluting industries and sectors into other sources of an economic basis, may find that these opportunities simply do not exist anymore. And at the same time, of course, the focus on green investments, the appetite for green investments by investors is lower, and also by policymakers. Sometimes the hard choices that need to be made and the tough decisions are harder to make in an environment where a crisis is already there. If we go to the next slide. So just to finish off very briefly, we wanted to give you an example of just transition in one of our countries of operation. We have an investment in Poland in one of the coal regions where we invest in an energy provider. But the challenge there really is that this investment and the transition away from coal affects a few thousand workers that are directly impacted by that, and only relatively few will be able to go into early retirement. So we have been working with our client to look at the inequality implications directly, also in relation to skills and profiles and gaps, to look at the opportunities for reskilling and the high quality certified training opportunities, internal deployment, but also very importantly, engaging with the external job market, looking at external job transfers in partnership with local education providers and the job centers, with a specific focus on women in the workplace for all the reasons that we have also discussed earlier on. So very importantly, though, all these activities are embedded within a wider regional focus, engaging the local stakeholders such as development agencies, the trade unions, sectoral associations, at national level, ministries for energy, treasury, and then also the EU, to make sure that these activities and the actions that we set with our client actually make sense and contribute, form part of a wider regional economic development strategy. And then the actual green investment that came on top of that in a way triggered these engagements. So I leave it at that, but I'm very happy to answer any questions. And thank you to Margarita also for stepping in.
Thank you very much, Barbara and Margarita, for that. And I'm sorry to rush everybody. I just want to make sure we get everybody's presentations in on time. Always such a wealth of activity going on at EBRD. We've had you present on some of these case studies in previous sessions, so really glad to have that information again. Hubert, I want to switch to you now, talking about the work of the EIB and thinking about the just transition mechanism and all the ways you're trying to incorporate these ideas into some of your investment plans. So if you wouldn't mind, we'll give you about 10 minutes and I'll start going like this if you if you get close to the time. Thanks, Hubert.
Yeah, I'm afraid you will have to. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks to Barbara and her colleague Margarita for a fascinating presentation on the EBRD work on just transition. To make the transition between two presentations, let me say that EBRD is doing good work on just transition, and we are actually working together because the EBRD has also carried out a consultancy study at the moment on the understanding on just transition that involves all the larger institutions, the multinational development banks, and we are very happy to provide comments to this excellent work that is coming out of this. And we are working closely together on that topic. Now, if you put the next slide, please, to get me started. Here at the EIB, we are very close to EU policies, as always. The European Commission has committed to mobilize at least 1 trillion of investment in the next decade to support a just and green transition. Within that, the EIB contribution is expected to amount to around 250 billion in terms of mobilized investment under various EU mandates, that is, EU instruments and through the EU budget. In addition, the EIB is on its way to dedicate 50% of our lending to climate and environment by 2025. This compares with today's 25% target for climate only. The new 50% target implies a total of 1 trillion in investments for climate and environment over the coming decade, which includes the EIB own financing operations, as well as those I just mentioned under EU mandates. Important to add that the other 50% of our lending will need to live up to the do no harm principle, which is being specified in legislation and will be determined in the near future. Moreover, the EIB has committed to reach full alignment with the Paris Agreement by the end of 2020. So this is the scene setter for the green transition. The transition to a climate neutral EU economy by 2050 will, however, entail a profound social and economic challenge for regions that today still depend heavily on carbon-intensive industries and mining. There's a risk of significant job losses, lower regional GDP, and lower tax revenues. Many of these areas that are most affected are already today places left behind that deal with stranded assets, shrinking towns and communities, and growing inequalities. Without due attention to the economic and social needs of these territories, the political consensus on decarbonization could dwindle, and the ownership could get lost, and the decarbonization could get delayed. In fact, for most, wait a minute. For most of the affected communities, the transition ahead implies entering uncharted territories. While they will have to make radical changes to their energy mix and huge investments into the energy efficiency of buildings and production modes, the most affected regions will only meet their labor reallocation challenge if they manage to retrain and upskill their workforce and manage to attract new economic activities with a view to limiting massive emigration of young people. The Joint Research Center of the European Commission estimates that some 450,000 jobs in the EU directly or indirectly depend on coal mining and coal-fired electricity generation. These jobs are concentrated on only 20 out of the 240 EU regions. So the good news in this is that the other regions have already got out of coal mining and coal-fired power production. But it also shows the attention that we need to devote to these 20 regions. So next slide, please. The complete overhaul of economic development paths facing the most affected regions can only be successful with a very broad strategy. Indeed, just transition entails multiple transition to ensure a balanced, integrated territorial development and an economic future for the most coal and heavy industry dependent territories. The transition will have several dimensions, and this resembles very much the 3 just transition priority themes that the EBRD just presented, with the only difference perhaps that we split the green economy transition into an energy transition and an environmental transition, which would entail all the site regeneration efforts, the afforestation efforts, and the cleaning efforts that are needed to enable future economic development for new sectors. So this is why we can now move on to the next slide, please. So this suggests that to meet the just transition challenge, a one-size-fits-all policy will not do the trick, but it will take a broad, multi-sector and place-specific strategy. Here also we are very much aligned on what the EBRD thinks. I think it's just a truism. A strategy that addresses the specific economic, social and environmental challenges in vulnerable communities. The tremendous reallocation of labor and land to new uses requires good spatial planning and a just transition master plan that coordinates the sectoral needs under a sound governance structure and makes sure that all stakeholders concerned are around the table and have a say and can help to plan their own future. Regions need to be aware of their specific strengths that decades of industrial activity have allowed building up, but can be put to new uses. For example, many companies in the German Ruhr area are nowadays exporters of environmental technology solutions. Another example, take the UN University in Maastricht in the Netherlands, which was created 50 years ago in response to the country's decision to phase out coal mining in the Limburg region. Nowadays, it's one of the best universities in the Netherlands. Other aspects and experiences of historic transitions have been more mixed and should also be incorporated in today's strategy making to avoid repeating others' mistakes in the past. The EIB has a long track record in supporting just transition projects. For example, in the form of large-scale environmental rehabilitation projects in Germany, for example, the Lusatia brownfields rehabilitation, or the Emscher River renaturation and industrial diversification. Then we do multi-sector framework loans to foster regional development projects, for example, economic diversification in Brandenburg, or regional infrastructure in Moravskoslezsko in the Czech Republic and in Castilla y León in Spain. Or urban renewal projects in several towns in Silesia in Poland. Here, our work with the Polish municipality of Katowice over the past 20 years is a good example. More than 205 million euros in loans contributed to Katowice's successful transition from a stagnating coal mining town to a vibrant urban center, offering new business opportunities and a healthier environment for its citizens. Now let us look ahead. Next slide, please. As I said, we are closely aligned with EU policies. We are helping the European Commission and the European Union to smoothen the transition and leave no one behind. And for that, the European Union is setting up the Just Transition Mechanism as an integral part of the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan, which will mobilize some 100 billion of investments during the next EU budget planning framework. So to be clear, the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan as a total is 1 trillion over 10 years. And the Just Transition Mechanism within that plan will mobilize 100 billion in investments over the next 7 years. So with contributions from the EU member states, the EU budget, the member states, as well as contributions from InvestEU and the EIB and private financiers, of course. All actions under the Just Transition Mechanism must be located in the territories that are most affected by the EU's transition to a low-carbon economy or benefit those territories. With territory being a granular concept, referring to administrative levels, not 1 but 2 layers below the nation state, called NUTS 3 regions in the EU jargon, such as Spanish provinces or French départements. While the member states are still in the process of selecting their most affected territories, the European Commission has already published a list of 112 such territories based on emissions and sector employment data. Before drawing down any EU funds, member states need to present their territorial just transition plans and get them approved by the European Commission. These plans are like a short version of the operational programs under the EU cohesion policy, with a number of requirements such as spelling out the challenges, the investment needs, and spelling out the strategy to address these needs and the financing plan. As you can see on this slide, the investment need, which comes from the European Commission communication on the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan, the Just Transition Mechanism consists of 3 pillars. On the left-hand side in blue, you see Pillar 1, which is a grant vehicle supporting investments in the following areas: SMEs, R&D and innovation, energy efficiency, renewable energy, emission reduction, digitalization, decontamination, land restoration, upskilling, retraining workers, and job search. The investment target is still around 40 billion euros, even though the parameters of this vehicle have changed since the publication of this paper, because of the EU Heads of States Summit in July. There will be 17.5 billion in fresh EU grants, which need to be topped up with at least 11 billion from the EU structural funds. This total of 29 billion will be matched by national co-financing obligations of 10 to 15 billion. Like in the EU cohesion policy, the EU grant share is higher the poorer the benefiting region is in terms of GDP per capita. So 85% will be the grant share in regions with per capita GDP up to 75% of the EU average, 40% for regions with per capita GDP above the EU average, and 60% for regions in between. Sorry.
Just about
Pillar
1 minute.
2 is the Pillar 2 is the Just Transition cross window under InvestEU, the EU guarantee program for the next programming period that aims at mobilizing 650 billion in private sector investment with higher levels of risk for sustainable infrastructure, SMEs, R&D, and social development and skills. While by definition, the use of this pillar will be demand-driven, the EU's policy target is that 7% of all investment should benefit just transition areas, which would correspond to 45 billion. Pillar 3, finally, is the public sector loan facility. It will help unleash 25 billion in investment with the help of 10 billion in EIB loans for projects addressing the serious socio-economic challenges deriving from the transition towards EU's climate targets. The total investment target is 25 billion. As a special trigger for these projects, the EU will provide grants up to 1.5 billion. Each project obtaining an EIB loan under the facility may apply for an investment grant of up to 15 to 20% of the loan amount. Additional financing partners over and above the EIB might come on board if and when the EU obtains permission to generate additional own revenues, for example, from an enlargement of the ETS certificates sales. The particular feature of this proposed Pillar 3 regulation is that there is no positive list of eligible sectors, but applicants need to provide sufficient evidence of the geographic eligibility being met and the transition benefits of their project. Across all the 3 pillars of the Just Transition mechanism, EIB advisory services will help to build the project pipeline starting from the territorial Just Transition plans. In Pillar 1, we have JASPERS, the initiative that has helped over the past 14 years to prepare major projects under the EU funds. And in Pillars 2 and 3, we have the European Investment Advisory Hub that will help to prepare projects. In conclusion, let me say that the EIB may support projects outside the above 3 pillars, and notably projects outside the EU with a Just Transition dimension, building on our track record on industrial transition projects. The European lessons from coal exits and industrial transition can certainly be brought to fruition elsewhere in the world. If I have focused so much on EU policies here, it is because it has absolute priority for our institution. I have not dealt in detail with the indicators on how we measure transition, but when I saw, I might refer to the EBRD slide on this reduction in emissions, for example, number of workers trained, number of beneficiaries. We very much have a similar set of indicators. So just for completeness, and I stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Hubert. Okay, last but certainly not least, Carolina Herrera, you stuck in there for a number of presentations and want to get some of the views of your work and NRDC's work on thinking about the role of green banks and development banks in the energy transition and how you're starting to incorporate just transition into how you think about that and NDCs. So please, Carolina, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to join the event and sort of join this discussion. It's really been some fascinating presentations that I'm eager to sort of learn more about. So I'll jump right in. You can sort of just skip to the next slide. I'm going to be looking at Chile and Mexico to basically explore 3 sort of general ideas for what might be needed to form part of a just transition in Latin America and how this idea of transitioning certain institutions to green investment banks could fit in. So the first is that just transitions in Latin America obviously do need to look at fossil fuels, but also other aspects of the energy sector, including energy access and obviously other productive sectors that are going to have to undergo very rapid transitions like the forestry and agricultural sector that Anna was mentioning. And there's also just the other point is that there's been a lot of climate work in the region focused on clean energy transitions to reduce emissions, but discussions about what the equity considerations might be for people and sectors not just from climate change, but also climate change solutions sometimes seem to be parallel conversations. And these are going to have to be brought together very rapidly. And then the third point is that since the transitions that are going to be needed to address climate change are really about long-term development strategies, it's going to be very important to align the mandates and strategies of the local development finance institutions with the types of transformations that will be necessary, similarly to the two examples that we were just hearing about. Looking at Chile, this is a country where the energy sector, broadly speaking, is by far the largest greenhouse gas emitter. 40% of Chile's electricity generation is coal-based, so coal represents about 25% of total emissions. And these coal plants are located in 6 municipalities that are often cited as examples of sacrifice zones where there's multiple polluting industries and the air quality doesn't meet sort of environmental standards. So the coal phase down in Chile is a key measure for achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, but also for achieving greater social justice. And in 2018, the Ministry of Energy and the coal companies reached a voluntary agreement to phase out coal. And last year in June, they announced that all 28 existing coal plants would be shut down or reconverted by 2040. So by the first phase of this, 2024, Chile expects to have shut down 11 coal plants. And sort of in the longer term, this schedule is going to be revisited every 5 years to determine dates for the remaining plants. Prior to this announcement of the shutdown schedule that was ultimately agreed on bilateral conversations, there was a multi-stakeholder working group that analyzed the impacts of the phase out on security and economic efficiency of the electric system, on sort of the local economic activity and some of the local environmental and social factors. So however fast the shutdown occurs, this concept of what a just transition might look like is now very much part of the conversation. And as Ana was mentioning, a couple of months ago in June, Chile launched a process to create a strategy for a just transition in energy. And there's approximately about 14,000 impacted workers in the communities where these plants are located, between direct and indirect workers. But the goal of the thinking and the strategy does seem to be to consider a jobs transition, yes, and where these workers can sort of transition to, but also look at other needs and investments in the communities to improve conditions there. So the strategy creation is going to be done through a participatory process and through dialogues. The first draft of the strategy itself is expected in December of this year. Then there will be a public consultation process, and then it'll actually be published in the first half of next year. And then the strategy will provide a framework for the later development of local action plans in each of the affected communities to identify sort of the specific needs there and actions. But there are other sectors in energy that Chile is going to have to start thinking about just transition for. Some people were mentioning, what a just transition will look like in transportation. This is very much the case in Chile, where there's, a desire to advance the electric vehicle sector rapidly, but also, for example, what it will mean when manufacturing industries start moving towards new energy sources. There's, plans in the government to really sort of move forward with green hydrogen, as they call it. And then in the residential sector, there's a recent energy transition strategy for the residential energy sector, which sort of specifies that areas where that strategy needs to be implemented also need to develop local action plans to ensure a just transition. And the context there is that wood burning is actually the main fuel source for residential heating in Chile. So how, as that sector becomes more regulated and it shifts to other heating alternatives, how do you ensure energy cost is accessible for communities? And the wood, the informal wood fuel workforce is sort of protected from these changes. In the next slide. And then in Mexico, just very briefly, again, similar to Chile, very high fossil fuel dependency, but the difference here is that unlike Chile that doesn't have its own fossil fuels, Mexico has Pemex, a state oil and gas company. That's a major source of annual revenue for the government. And there's been a lot of work in Mexico on what a clean transition needs in terms of the policy, the financial instruments, the market instruments. And what sort of happened is that as that's moved forward, certain social dimensions were not always necessarily part of the clean energy discussion. So for example, how to actually be using clean energy to alleviate poverty or support economic development. So some of the groups that are starting to work on just transition concepts in Mexico, it's not a new concept, but it's certainly less extended, have been pointing to the need for, obviously, first, the imperative to move away from fossil fuels, but also the need to do this in a way that is advancing these broader development goals. And that may mean strengthening certain policies related to evaluating the social impacts of projects, the planning of the energy sector, consultation processes, but also starting to conceive of projects in different scales. So smaller distributed generation projects, with different types of ownership, maybe even collective ownership, to really be ensuring that local communities are sharing in the benefits. And obviously the other energy transition there is the fossil fuel sector, what that means for jobs in PEMEX, but also what does it mean if PEMEX is exposed to external, climate risk, climate transition risks, and because they they represent such an important part of the overall national budget, how does that then flow to state and local levels, and what does that mean for the provision of social services as part of a just climate transition? So finally, kind of looking at the case of Mexico and sort of the role of one particular NDB there, we really do think that national development banks as local development finance institutions can play a key role for advancing climate transitions in Latin America. They already have the role of economic development and social inclusion, and they can be transformational, as some of the other speakers were saying, if they integrate climate considerations and are mobilizing financing sort of the types of projects that are aligned with the Paris Agreement, and are bringing along the commercial banking sector as well. And there's one case of Banobras, which is sort of the infrastructure and public work development bank, and they have a sustainable bank strategy that they have been developing over the past few years and implementing, that's focused on accessing capital through sustainable bonds and climate funds that they can use for sustainable projects. They've been implementing an environmental and social risk management system to sort of mitigate some of the impacts that the projects may be having on communities. And they're also focusing on trying to identify green projects, but that also have a very high social impact. And one interesting thing with this particular bank is that because they can work with states and municipalities, this is a way to sort of be able to also finance some of the sustainable projects that are being identified at that local level and really move those forward. The work, and you can go to the next slide, please. The work NRDC has been doing over the past few years in Latin America with regards to green finance has particularly been focused on how the model of green investment banks, so sort of specialized financial institutions that are focused on green sectors and market development, can be adapted for the region. And in our view in Latin America, given the sort of the current context of existing national development institutions, we're really seeing that this means reorienting some of these existing institutions to behave more like green banks. And that essentially sort of boils down to making sure that these institutions have the mandate to focus their efforts and funds on particular sectors and meet certain metrics, whether it's new jobs in the clean energy sector, creating the capacities both internally of specialized teams, but also externally, so that any TA can, any assistance can be provided to communities or elsewhere to identify and design projects, and obviously bringing together the capital both from public funds, whether it's their own or from international climate finance, or private sources, whether it's commercial banks or issuing green bonds, which Banobras has been doing over the past several years. And I think I'll leave it at that, given the time.
That's great. Wonderful. Thank you, Carolina. I think that's such an interesting perspective, and thanks for staying on time too. If we have enough time, if you each can respond with 1 or 2 minute answers, I'm going to try and get each of you a question. And I'll tell you all of them now, so you'll kind of be working on your response and the brevity of your response. But Barbara, there was a question about sort of incorporating these frameworks and the planning into the Just Transitions strategy and approach. So if you could talk a little bit about that in sort of thinking about the framework for incorporating some of these issues. And then Hubert, if you could talk about the pipeline. I mean, it's such a huge amount of money. to be sort of funneling into these exercises, and what does the project pipeline look like, and is it adequate? And then Carolina, I was really struck by, you know, the focus that NRDC has on sort of reorienting the national development banks. It just strikes me that there's so much regional development planning that has gone into and was talked about in the context of the EBRD EIB approach. How much of a gap do you see in how much capacity building would these banks have to do in terms of just getting these regional development plans incorporated as part of what they're doing, and how big of a lift is that? So maybe we'll go Barbara, Hubert, and then Carolina, and if you can keep them quick, that'd be great.
Thank you very much. So if we look at developing broader frameworks and looking at some of the challenges also of integrating just transition into larger regional frameworks, I think there are a number of things to consider. The first one, if you go into a region, if you work with your stakeholders in a particular country, I think timing is very important. It is all about when does that happen. Look at what is the election timetable. You know, what is coming up politically, economically. What are the other circumstances that this country faces? So I think timing is important. The second one is an agreement on which actions to take. And here we already have some experience having worked with some of our partners where maybe the expectations are at a local level initially, and the responses that would be put forward may not necessarily be very long term. It may be about forcing incoming companies to employ people who were let go or who lose their livelihoods from that transition. That is very often not a very sustainable approach to be taken. And then to actually move away and move the discussion towards longer term approaches that are very much more embedded into longer term regional development, economic development can be hard. A third point is about the difficulties of attracting inward investment. It really depends on the region, it depends on the economic opportunities in a given region. And then the fourth one is we need to understand the wider regional challenges, particularly when we look at depopulation in our countries of operation. There are entire regions that are depopulating at an unprecedented scale, where people don't even move to their capital anymore, but move straight out of the country and sometimes even out of the region. So these are huge flows, these are huge demographic and economic challenges that these regions face, which in a way go beyond the just transition challenges, but need to be addressed and need to be considered when we actually want to create a viable just transition plan as part of a regional development plan.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Hubert, on the project pipeline.
On the pipeline, you're right to ask this question. The amounts are gigantic, and we need to fill it with projects, or our member states need to fill it with projects. And this is indeed problematic in some places, especially in regions and countries where promoter capacity is not known to be state of the art. And this is why we need advisory services to help build a project pipeline. And this is very much where we see the EIB's role, since the just transition plans are set up without direct participation of the EIB by the countries and regions. The just transition plans are really relatively high level. And to translate these plans into concrete projects, it will take some help, and governments will have to sit down again. So having a territorial just transition plan is not enough. However, we have some visibility on investment needs in several regions, thanks to our advisory involvement. For example, I mentioned JASPERS before. The JASPERS service of the EIB has helped the Coal Regions in Transition platform to screen projects in 3 Polish coal mining regions, but also in the Slovak Republic and in the Czech Republic. And from these 3 exercises, there are a few high-level lessons to take. One is that you could easily use up all your money with energy projects, because the challenges are so tremendous in energy efficiency, but also in changing the energy mix, that you could easily use up all the money. So it's not so difficult to use those billions. But if you do so, of course, you will have net job losses. So you need really a balanced strategy to cater both to the energy needs and to the job market needs. What we also know is that ecological regeneration is extremely expensive. For example, the Lusatia brown coal area, the state-owned company that is in charge of regenerating the area and of managing the transition from active mining into regenerated places has spent 10 billion euros over the past 20 years into afforestation, regeneration, cleaning up the sites. 10 billion euros. The IB modestly supported these efforts with 2 loans amounting to 500 million together. So, and for example, Germany's 3 major lignite basins, they have relatively detailed investment plans to cushion the coal exit by 2038, and that will consume 40 billion in federal grants. So the projects are there, but they need to be driven by good promoters and need to be developed. And Silesia also has a huge investment plan, quite detailed already.
Thank you, Brad. That's very, very interesting. Carolina, we're going to give you the final answer here.
Great, thank you. So I would say just quickly, the banks, the national development banks, they know their sectors that they're focused on and their regions the best. So in that sense, there's a lot of knowledge there already. There will definitely need to be sort of filling a gap of, you know, what are the capacities and the tools that are necessary to finance specific particular technologies or solutions. There's going to need to be sort of a gap that needs to be filled in terms of strengthening participatory processes and making sure that the banks are involved early on in the development of, you know, what the action plans might be, or what the regional development plans might be, to make sure that types of considerations that will come up once a project gets to the bank are being considered early enough in the process. And there's also going to have to be a gap that's filled with relation to you know, how environmental and social risks are being managed from, you know, internally in the bank. So there's definitely certain gaps in capacity that are going to have to be filled as part of this process. But again, these banks have a long history working in their regions and in their particular sectors. They're often very sectoral based. And so I think it's definitely something that is going to be able to move forward.
Great, thank you. Well, I wish we had all day to be talking more about the complexity of these issues that you've raised, but we think it's really been a great discussion. You've put a lot on the table for a lot of people who are paying attention and working in these fields themselves. So we will try and find a way to get some of the questions we left on the table answered after the fact. But I just want to say a big thank you to Hubert and to Barbara and to Carolina and to Anna and to Joy for and Margarita for all of your contributions in this conversation. I'm going to quickly turn it over to my colleague Hugh Seawright from the Climate Investment Funds to maybe say some closing words.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thank you. Yeah, I realize we're out of time, so just a very quick thank you from the Climate Investment Funds. I'd like to thank all the speakers who did an absolutely brilliant job in covering a lot of critical areas to work-related impacts, specifically gender impacts and informal economy and place-based investments. These are core components of the work that we're doing with CSIS. And this was a great insight into many of these areas that we'll be looking into in the course of the project. I think one clear element that we heard loud and clear from all the speakers was the need for multi-stakeholder consultations. It's very clear that no one department or ministry or stakeholder group can get this challenging transition done alone. That's very clear. And that's a key motivation for the work of the JTI between the CIF and the CSIS. And we hope that some of the convening platforms that we're setting up through the JTI will help lay the foundation for many of these discussions, including some of the case studies that we're doing through the CIF in our countries of operation, to kind of give that platform for these multi-stakeholder engagements. That's a core component of this work. So we really appreciate some of the reflections today from the speakers and all the brilliant questions that we received, which we'll be taking on board in the next phase of the research. So thanks once again for taking the time. I realise we're up against it here, so just one more thank you from us, and very much hope you can stay engaged with the work of the GATI going forward, and you'll be hearing from us in the future. So thanks so much again, everybody.